Hello, my name is Susan Lapatina, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Education and Corporate Marketing at the American Apparel and Footwear Association, or AAFA. Together with my colleagues, Nate Herman, Senior Vice President of Policy at AAFA, and Barry McGeough, Global Vice President of Advanced Concepts and Innovations at Wolverine Worldwide, we're going to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes talking about digital transformation in the footwear industry. It's all about the I, innovation, intelligence, and improvement. First, a brief introduction of AAFA. The American Apparel and Footwear Association is the largest trade association in the United States, representing apparel and footwear brands, retailers, wholesale companies, and the supplier community, all of whom produce and distribute product across global markets. Focusing on three core areas critical to the business operations of our industry: brand protection, supply chain and manufacturing, and trade, AAFA provides its members with expertise across these disciplines to support the complex global marketplace. United under our mission of advocacy that fits, AAFA works to educate and advocate for the footwear industry, both in the United States and abroad. As a part of our educational mission, we endeavor to bring thought leadership on cutting-edge issues affecting our industry. So let's meet our speakers today. I have the pleasure of introducing first Nate Herman, who leads AAFA's policy department, managing the association's lobbying and regulatory affairs activities. He leads the corporate social responsibility practice, formulating and implementing CSR policy while representing the industry on CSR issues before governments, NGOs, and other key stakeholders. As AAFA's resident economist, Nate develops industry data, statistics, and key resources such as our sourcing and country profiles to support complex regulations and compliance throughout the supply chain. Prior to joining AAFA, Nate worked at the US Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, and 2 years as the department's industry analyst for footwear and travel goods industries. Barry McGeough is senior leader at Fortune 500 companies in the footwear, apparel, and technology sectors. He has spent his career developing innovation-led product and category growth strategies for some of the world's most iconic outdoor and performance brands. Having been granted multiple patents, he has created award-winning footwear and has pioneered connected and wearable devices with outdoor and Olympic athletes at both the North Face and Speedo. As founder and group vice president of the Innovation Next division at PVH, he built engagement models to drive innovation solutions for new functional fiber, sustainability, and solving for ocean plastics. Focused on circularity and the industry's growing relationship with tech and the Internet of Things, Barry is working to meet the demands of the new data-driven consumer, both developing and implementing processes to deliver full value chain innovation. Most recently, Barry has been appointed Global Vice President of Advanced Concepts and Innovations at Wolverine Worldwide. In this newly created role, he will help the company leverage new technologies, materials, and other advancements to drive big ideas, product innovations, and digital transformation, improvements for the customer experience. AAFA has a long history of working with the industry in Vietnam. Not only is Vietnam an important supply chain partner for our industry, as we will discuss today, but AAFA has organized numerous events with LaFaso to ensure better and a shared understanding about trade policies, compliance, and social responsibility. It is this commitment to better communication across the supply chain that forms the spirit of our conversation on digitalization today. So before we dive into the conversation, I'd first like to ask Nate to provide some context on the US-Vietnam trade relationship. Nate?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, the bottom line is that over the last 20 years, Vietnam has become a strategic and frankly a critical partner for the US footwear industry. In the last 10 years, Vietnam has been the second largest supplier of footwear to the US market after China. And in fact, Vietnam has become the first place people look when they leave China. Vietnam is the go-to location for companies as they're leaving China and looking to diversify their sourcing. And the numbers show that in the last 4 years alone, the Vietnam share of US footwear imports has increased from 16% to 26%. So it really is a critical supplier and a critical partner to the US footwear industry.
Thank you. Nate, I'm also going to ask if you could provide some context on what the industry is experiencing now as a result of the health and economic crises triggered by COVID-19, if you would.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, obviously everyone's going through a lot of changes in the last 6 months because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19. Our industry in the United States has seen major changes driven by the fact that retail has essentially been driven off a cliff. We've seen the retail sales numbers at clothing and shoe stores drop in the last 4 months by dramatic levels, 89%, 60%, 40%. And even the last month, even though numbers are slowly improving, we still saw that retail sales were down almost 20% versus July of 2019. And so we're still dealing with sort of a retail environment that is completely different than we had just 6 months ago. And it's an environment that has changed. What consumers are buying is different, how they're buying is different, how our members, how the industry is reacting is all different. We're talking about people looking not to buy dress shoes or fashion shoes because there's no place to wear them anymore. So people are looking to have shoes to go outside. So outdoor footwear has become very popular. Comfort shoes have become very popular. And athletic shoes have also become very popular. And so it's really changed the dynamic of what people are buying, how they're buying, and we'll get into this a little more later, I believe, is they're buying through e-commerce, they're buying online. And even if they're going to the store, all they're doing at the store is picking up products that they purchased online. So it's a whole different way of delivering the product to the customer that people are not used to. And then finally, as many of you know, because you've been producing it for our members, is that many in the industry have moved to increase personal protection equipment production, or PPE production. And so many of you had to move your factories from making footwear to making face masks or surgical gowns. And so that's been a change as well. And AAFA, our association, has been working very hard to provide our members the information they need to do that. And we have a lot of that information on our COVID-19 dashboard on the AAFA website. But it really has been a dramatic transformation that we're still going through, and has definitely changed the dynamic across not only the United States, but across our entire supply chain, including with Vietnam.
Great, thanks, Nate. And it was a great way to pinpoint what is absolutely happening real time right now, and also how to lead into the real crux of our conversation today. And Barry, I'm going to turn to you because we're talking about transformation, which is something that is a passionate commitment on your part. So let me kick it off with you, and let's turn to digitalization now. And we hear a lot about this term, and everyone's discussing the concept. But what is it exactly? Can you take us through that, please?
Sure. And Susan, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak on this panel and to speak to Nate, who it's great to see Nate again. Look, we can start in a few different ways. There's the definition of digital and digitalization. And I want to sort of put out there just from the very beginning that everything we're going to talk about today is not futurism. I'm not a futurist. I'm definitely not a doctor. What I really want to put forward is the idea that the things that we're going to talk about today are not wild and furry ideas that are abstract in some certain way. The idea around what's happening in a digital environment was happening anyways. And keying onto what Nate just mentioned, what we're seeing now is COVID and the current health crisis as an accelerant to all the things that we were seeing, either from a retail contraction point of view and also from a digitalization point of view. Now, very few of us were born digital. I happen to work for a company that was started in the late 1880s. It was by default, could never have been born digital. These are new behaviors. To become digital and become digitally native are new behaviors, and we're finding that from a regional perspective, different regions are adopting the digitalization of their processes, practices, and even societies in different ways at different paces. So from a product point of view, we're looking really at apparel, accessories, and footwear. We think of this whole world, we can call it the digital, right? One of my mentors used to refer to it as the digital. So, but we break that apart into two different areas: digital product, digital experience. So when we're talking about digital product, we can discuss product connected to the IoT that does some certain thing. If you can get something like a Fitbit or an activity tracker, that's a product connected to the IoT. You're getting data back and forth. Digital experience is really around what happens when we're starting to interact with the digital environment in the ways that we transact in a commercial way. And what's bolted onto that is what's happening on the digital supply chain side. How is it made? How is it manufactured? And how does everything feed into each other as we go into an era of what we're expecting to be increased consumer centricity? So when we think about digitization, we think about the digitization or digitalization of everything. When we can digitize an asset in some way, how can that digital asset be used across the value chain? And how can it be used in multiple ways to get to greater consumer centricity and to inspire the behavior that we want our consumers to engage in? So, and it is important, and it came up in the conversation earlier around the difference between, and maybe the Webster differentiation between digitalization and digitization. So digitalization is when you use a digital asset to change your business process. So we would look at things like product to service and software service, and I believe that we'll touch on that a little bit later. And that's when you're using digital assets to be able to enhance what you're already doing. Digitization is when you take what's on a record and you put it on a CD. You're taking those analog assets and you're making it into ones and zeros. And so the digitization of process from a supply chain point of view would really be around what we're looking at in terms of automated manufacture. So we'll use those terms in this conversation, sometimes interchangeably, but it is important to note that we will be thinking about digitalizing analog products and then digitizing analog processes. So that's kind of how we think about the definition case of what's happening in the digital space.
Thank you, Barry. We've been talking about digitalization as an industry for a while, and brands and retailers and all of their supply chain partners have been exploring with one another how to move in a more robust manner and how to really embrace it. But now that we've experienced COVID, and as you talked about accelerating the necessity for this, could you maybe share a few examples or particular trends right now that are important in the digitalization piece for our industry?
Absolutely. One of the things that's important to know is that the digitalization of things, or the advancement of things, let's talk about automation. The automation of things is age old. I've heard some interesting conversations about what happens when manufacturing is automated. And I remind people that the manufacturing of socks is 100% automated, They've been self-knitting themselves for 100 years, and no one worries about socks knitting themselves, and yet they do. So this is just an accelerated process of what we've already known from the first industrial revolution to the fourth. But look, we can talk about some things that are commonplace now in the digital space that we may take for granted, right? I mean, after making cotton gin and socks, we went to the era of fax machines. So who has a fax machine anymore? Nobody, right? So, but we can talk about the digitization of things with things like order placement, looking at PLM systems for BOM accuracy. We can think about 3D design that increases speed. On the logistics side, some things we don't really think about anymore are container tracking for logistics. What does it mean when we're using blockchain to certify the delivery of things, to speed the process along, to make that more accurate? We can look at RFID in automated warehouses. Automated warehouses themselves are totally digitized, right? I love, and there was a lot of heat around looking at what the company Kiva did with the Amazon warehouses, where instead of having humans go to a shelf, the shelf comes to a human for picking. So these are things which just are great innovations in the digitalization of things and the digitization of things. One of the great examples in our space is innovation, bringing a new idea into an enterprise. So one of the things I think about is this idea of what people think of as an epic fail in innovation, Google Glass. Google Glass is fascinating because it was a technology which would allow for heads-up display inside your glasses where you can see out there in the real world, and the real world can display things into your glass. It was positioned to be a consumer oriented item, total fail. And yet Google Glass for enterprise is a multi-billion-dollar industry now, and people are putting together Rolls-Royce airline engines by seeing the wiring display in their glasses as they put them together with incredible accuracy. So there's so much technology right now in our current supply chains that probably more than, there's more in there that we've forgotten about, that it's good to remind ourselves how digital our process already is.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I want to bring both of you into the conversation and continue along those lines. But from the vantage points that you each have, we're seeing that life, work life, personal life, family life, culture, social engagement has all become very blended. And there are many, what we might call mega trends affecting this digital revolution. Certainly climate change, of course, government policies, all the various demographics and generations that are consuming products. So I'd actually like to ask both of you if you could talk a little bit about the mega trends affecting the digital revolution. Nate, maybe if you want to start off with a little bit around government and some of the other areas that you're working on that you see.
Very good question, Susan. Obviously, we're seeing this every day as all of us are on Zoom or the 100 of other conferencing websites, is that technology is great and it facilitates everything except when it doesn't work. And that's because of bandwidth issues or other issues. And that in many cases is where government comes in and could either be very helpful or very unhelpful. And this is throughout the digitalization, as Barry described. And so you have a lot of issues at play today, many of them involved in the trade war that's happening between China and the United States. So 5G, the 5G technology, in order to succeed in a lot of these things, particularly the digitization, when you're doing all this stuff through the internet and designing product and sharing things, you need fast internet, you need and able to handle huge capacity of information. And there's been a big issue with 5G because of a Chinese company called Huawei. And what the US government's trying to do to restrict that and trying to get other governments to restrict Huawei, and that's concerned because of allegations that Huawei is providing private data to the Chinese government. And so that could hamper the development of 5G, which could then hamper the implementation of many of these technologies that Barry is talking about. Another issue, there's the US government, the Trump administration has talked about implementing restrictions on an app called WeChat. WeChat in China and increasingly elsewhere in Asia has become the means for basically for a consumer to do everything online. Through that app, they can pay for things, they can buy things, they can do pretty much everything, order taxi service, order everything. And so if you cut that off as a means to reach those consumers, you're really potentially hamstringing US companies from being able to fully implement these technologies. And so US government action or inaction can really have a major impact on the development of digitization and digitalization. I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Barry.
No, look, I think I love that we were talking about this idea around Huawei and 5G, because a lot of people really think of these as quite abstract telecommunication constructs that don't really touch our industry. But we're looking at commerce. So how does commerce transact itself from a brand perspective, from a product perspective? And what we can look at is from two different levels. One is we can talk about what 5G will generate, and then we can also look from a commercial perspective, and you mentioned WeChat, and we can look at marketplaces with China as proxy. So if we're looking at China as proxy, we can see that unencumbered by privacy, and that's not a qualitative conversation. I don't make a comment on privacy, right? But the attitude toward privacy is completely different in China than it is in the West. So if you were, as an academic case study, you just throw privacy away and say, we don't care about privacy, what would markets look like? It's fascinating to buy from the app. And it's fascinating to consider what society can do with the data, what businesses can do with the data. Because on the flip side of that, there's consumer expectations. And whether we like it or not, consumers expect brands to know me. I want you to know me. You should know my preferences. You shouldn't recommend things to me that I wouldn't wear. You should know my size, because if I order something, it's the wrong size, I'm going to be mad at you, right? And you should get it to me tomorrow. Consumer expectations far outpace the ability for technology to deliver. And that requires information and data around when people shop, where people shop, what people buy. And so if we were in a world where privacy didn't matter at all, we could look at China and say this seamless execution of commercial activity in ways that we can't even understand and frankly envy. So we get into a really interesting conversation when we talk about data, privacy, and markets as we think about how things are commercial. And this is very, very interesting to see our take on it versus what is happening in China.
So let's take a little deeper dive here and talk about the footwear space and accessories and apparel in our industry. And both of you are talking about this acceleration of technology. Clearly, it continues and the pace quickens. And we may contend that in the last 7 months, it's even accelerated on top of what we expected due to COVID. So as an industry, we're trying to bring that into our business operations and deliver to the consumer in a very rich and meaningful way. Could you talk a little bit, Barry, I'll start with you, about maybe the pace of change, and as an industry, where do we need to be moving in context with pace?
So I'm going to put everything through the lens of consumer centricity. And so if we think about these larger ideas around policy and climate change, like as you mentioned before, then we have to think about what the consumer expects. So there's a Pew Charitable Trust study that recently came out early last year that it basically said that 65% of Americans trust brands more than governments to do the right thing. So if If normal citizens are expecting brands to step up to the plate and do the right thing, then the question is, do the right thing with what? So what I'm really a fan of is the Adidas Parlay for the Oceans activation. Adidas is stepping up to clean the oceans and make a commitment by 2025 to have all their materials be made from certified ocean plastics. They backed into something their supply chain could not commit to at that moment. And they said, we'll figure it out, right? They got incredible credit. Now, from a commercial point of view, it was probably one of the most successful innovation and sustainability activations that we've ever seen in our industry. It sold 1 million pairs of shoes in its first week. It was in every single retail store in Adidas on planet Earth. And it becomes a major, major platform for them. And that technology and those set of supply chain solutions were backed into by the expectation that the brand be better than governments. Now, think about another thing. We are in an era right now of social justice. People are talking about social justice in ways they've never thought of before. So that becomes the zeitgeist for which brands need to action behind. Now, if that's true, then what will we be able to do and what are consumers' expectations that we take these ideas around sustainability or new technology and go one better? So for example, we can recycle plastic bottles and put them into garments. This could be a recycled jacket. What people are asking for now is, what does that mean for people? What does that mean for humans? So I'm a huge fan of David Katz at Plastic Bank, but he is actually creating something, a social currency around collecting plastic, where he'll pay people in developing countries to pick trash up off the beach and stop it from going into the oceans, pay them in script that will allow them to buy transistor radios, malaria medication, school tuition, and that direct social give back gets woven into the apparel and footwear that you make. That's what people are starting to look for more and more, is how do we connect it back to humans? How do we do the next best thing? Because social good will become more and more important, and the need for brands to be the good, to be the change is more incumbent on us than ever before as governments nationalize and things become, and national ecosystems become smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right. I mean, we see this all over the place where the consumer expectation has dramatically changed over last year, and that's been driven by technology in many ways. They have much better access to information because of technology, and now they want companies in particular, as you said, because these are the organizations they trust the most. They want organizations and companies to take action, and we see that in the social responsibility space a lot, in terms of now we're getting questions, not only making sure that the factories that make the shoes, the actual assembly of the shoe itself, are being done in an ethical and humane way, and that the workers are being treated well, but they want us to go back and look at the cows that are produce the hides that lead to the leather. They want us to go back and look at how the textiles are made. They want us to look at the minerals that go into the eyelets and the zippers on the boots. And so the onus is on companies, is how can we use technology to get us that information so that we can affect change at that level. And so that's where, technology is pushing us, and technology might also be hopefully be our solution to addressing these issues.
Absolutely. And ironically, that's being the onus being pushed onto brands and CEOs and leadership is being pushed by an absence of global thinking, as we think less globally and think more regionally. And not to be political about this, but if nationalism increases, globalism decreases. But people still want the answer to this fixed ecosystem that we live in, this fixed bubble, right? Because we do live on a sphere of finite resources. So people want action. So where do they go? Who do they expect to enable that action? And if it's not going to be governments, it's going to be governments rather. It's going to be brands that they trust.
Let me draw out a comment, Nate, that you made a little bit earlier, and I wonder if you could give us a little more insight into this. As we talk about technology creating a new paradigm for our supply chains and manufacturing, the parallel is that US trade policy needs to accommodate these digital supply chains. Can you talk a little bit about whether you feel US trade policy is configured to accommodate, and perhaps what do you envision in terms of that change might be needed to support how our supply chains in our industry are evolving?
So the US trade policy seems to be going lately in the opposite direction of where technology is going, is the idea that technology is going to enable you to produce a shoe and all the materials that go into a shoe anywhere in the world, conceivably, even if you don't have the traditional supply chains to support that, and that you will enable the logistics to make it so that you can get that product from there to here in a faster time and get it into the consumer the way they want it, direct delivery within a certain period of time. The trade policy doesn't necessarily reflect that today in the United States. It is an issue because the trade policy seems to be moving away from it. It's becoming very much, we're not talking about broad trade agreements that cover regions or large parts of the world. We're talking about agreements with one other country that don't reflect the way supply chains have ever worked, and are reflecting it even less as digitization and digitalization come in. We're not dealing with just one country like Kenya. We're dealing with all of Africa, because Africa is a regional supply chain and then interacts with other parts of the world in Asia and elsewhere. And to negotiate a free trade agreement with just Kenya doesn't necessarily make sense in today's world and what we'll be seeing in the future. And so that's something that, as an association, we're working at to try and make policymakers realize that this is a global issue, and that especially as technology makes the world more digital and digitalized, is that we need trade policies that better reflect that. And of course, we always make the argument that those changes, trade policy that does reflect that, actually benefits American workers, because our industry employs 4 million people here in the United States, and they benefit because of these global supply chains and the technology that enables them.
Great. Well, Barry, we'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing at Wolverine. We know you just joined and leading a newly created business unit. Can you tell us a little bit about digitalization within Wolverine and some of the trends you're looking at and how you're approaching it?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'll just keep kind of coming back to this idea around consumer centricity, which has become increasingly more important as we think about the things that we need to lean into. And the idea, again, that everything that we were working on before just needs to go a whole lot faster now. So what we're definitely seeing right now is the rise of e-commerce transactions. I think we're all seeing this. And Nate, you mentioned earlier about how dress shoes are down, but outdoor shoes are up. Super, super interesting to see the changes in the markets. And Dick's Sporting Goods just actually reported a 25% year-on-year increase just a couple of days ago, based on what people are doing now versus what they did before. So they're doing a lot more of some things. Nobody's doing nothing, but they're doing less of some things and more of other things. One of the things that people are doing more of, shopping online. So we're looking at a shift in consumer behavior in how they transact. And that means that if we, as an industry and brands that have been traditionally wholesale oriented, have to make the pivot to be more digital and to embrace the digital on the direct to consumer side. So I'm sure that this is also common knowledge, but it was just reported about 10 days ago that Nike had a kind of an average e-commerce penetration, better than average, I think. Their goal for 2023 was to reach 30% e-commerce penetration for their overall P&L. By 2023, they met that already this year, done. Just blew through it, right? Now their goal is to get to 50% e-commerce penetration, and they're going to do it next year. Think about that. We've been working on B2B and omni-channel selling for a decade, and the industry average is something like 8 or 9%. We're going to go from 9% to 50% in 18 months. These are phenomenal. This is moving at phenomenal pace. So one of the things that we're looking at is how do we think about things in totally different ways. So the realization that we are retailers now, no matter how wholesale centric we are, is quite clear. And I'm not just talking about Wolverine, I'm talking about all brands. They have to think about what the end consumer wants if they're increasingly going to be selling more to end consumers and less to wholesalers. Or conversely, selling to end consumers via our wholesale partners, which is obviously very, very important. So one of the things that we did recently, as you noted, we're a new organization under the sun at Wolverine. It's just been a few months, but as this lean in was laid out to be required, we started doing something which was very interesting. If we want to have people spend more time with our brands, one of the things we need to incent is more time on site. So you have the choice between having a very transactional relationship online, buy if you like it, don't go away if you don't like it, and dropping, on a regular seasonal cadence 2 or 3 times a year. What we're seeing is we're going to need to increase our drop cadence to keep people excited and coming back to the site and having them spend more time on site. How do you get more comfortable with the product? How do you understand how it's going to fit, how it's going to feel, and whether it's going to be the right product for you? So we embarked on a very quick strike project to digitize 50 styles for the Sperry site so that you can view, when you go to the PDP page, you can view 50 shoes in Sperry. You can view it in 3D on your desktop, and you can make it bigger and smaller. And then if you want to, you can take your phone, shoot a QR code to it, and then see it in your living room. Even you can see it on your own human foot. So really, really interesting to be able to do this, but we were able to pull that off in 6 weeks. So we'll be doing more and more of those things, because what we see right now is the need for us as an industry to think about what happens in the digital space. So how do we become more digitally native? How do we inspire more interaction with our brands as we become more consumer centric? And then the next step of that is, how do you take this to the next level? How do you start to think about digitizing your product and digitalizing your product and processes in different ways? So one example that I absolutely love right now, and it's a perfect example of what we refer to as both innovation and foresight. Innovation is making something better, and foresight is thinking about things which can be very disruptive to you. And what would you do about it? What do you figure out what will help you and what will hurt you? What's an opportunity? So a great example of foresight in action that future-proofed one of our compatriots in the industry was what Lululemon did with Mirror. A year and a half ago, they invested in a company called Mirror that is exactly what it sounds, only it interacts with you and tells you how to work out. Shows you what your workout is, gives you biometrics and tells you what to do more, and leads classes in your house. A year and a half ago, we weren't thinking about COVID. So they were in a perfect premier pole position to purchase them about 6 weeks after COVID became reality, because they had done the research. And what they did is they digitized their product. They said, we sell yoga gear. But now we're also going to sell you a subscription to classes where you can wear that gear. So they created a completely new revenue stream by embracing software service model for someone that sells analog things. To me, that's an excellent, excellent example of someone using digitalization to improve their business and move into a completely new digital era.
Fascinating, Barry. It's really amazing to see what some of the mavericks in our industry are doing today, and to hear about your 6-week turnaround is just completely unheard of. So congratulations. What it also tells me is that having that very strong, very trusted relationship with your partners in the supply chain is really essential in driving this kind of massive transformation. Any big change is going to require an entire community closely collaborating and working together. Can you talk to us a little bit about the kinds of things that you look for to gauge the readiness of supply chain partners, whether it's from a technology perspective or otherwise, but some of the criteria that is important?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. So when we're talking about, look, there is an event horizon where we can start to see that when data and automated manufacture comes together with consumer intention, if we can start to do social prospecting, what do consumers want, and validate that, and then look at their expectations of speed, then when you blend all that together with fully automated manufacture, there is an event horizon where we can imagine that there is one-to-one everything. Now that's a years out, but in order to get there, the concept of speed to market becomes more and more important. It's not just about limiting the long tail of inventory in your warehouses, right? It's really, speed is not determined now by inventory. Speed is now determined by consumer expectation. But let's face it, if I don't get something from Amazon within 24 hours, I'm kind of upset. Our expectations may not necessarily be realistic. So when we're looking at factories, it's really, and partners, manufacturing partners and logistic partners, we're looking at people as an industry that can have the capability to shorten those lead times in meaningful ways. Automated manufacture, 3D sampling, PLM, digital printing, the digital printing of soft goods, short runs, 3D printing, not in just the sampling environment, but you think about what Adidas is doing with Carbon 3D and making fully digitized, fully 3D printed midsoles. Those are things, and with an MOQ of 1, these become really, really interesting as we lower these MOQs, think about manufacturing on a one-to-one basis, and improving speed becomes vitally important. And those become really, really interesting partners in our industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole supplier issue, and they're key to making this work. And you look at Vietnam, which is again a great partner for us, reliable partner, quality product, reasonable prices, timely delivery. But that delivery has changed significantly over the last 6 months when we need the product, and there's issues with capacity in Vietnam, in terms of the fact that the bulk of the materials that go into footwear made in Vietnam come from elsewhere. And so if you can start using 3D technology to produce some of those materials in-house, you can speed up the production time, because if you don't have to wait for those materials to come from elsewhere. And Vietnam experienced this directly during COVID, where when China started shutting down, some factories in Vietnam had to start shutting down as well, because the materials that those factories in Vietnam were using were coming from China. And so if you can replace that using technology, particularly 3D technology, to produce some of those materials in Vietnam, all of a sudden that gives the industry a leg up. If you're able to use some of the supply chain visibility with transportation logistics to speed the delivery to market, that could really give Vietnam a competitive advantage, so that they can service what Barry is describing here. So there are ways to come in and address the issues that could be limiting Vietnam in the future. Technology could be the answer. Finally, with the size of Vietnam versus China, per se, you're talking about 100 million people versus 1.4 billion people. There is going to be a capacity issue at some point. Technology allows you to increase that capacity without having to increase the number of people that are working in the industry, especially as footwear in Vietnam is competing against apparel, electronics, furniture, and many other industries for the same capacity. This could give the footwear industry in Vietnam a leg up, especially to serve this new market that Barry is describing.
Totally agree. And I wouldn't rule out automation as well. I mean, I saw a fantastic video on LinkedIn, unsubscribe. I don't know who actually posted it, but it was a really interesting view of someone being able to in an automated way, stitch a pocket to a pair of jeans. That's a very, very complicated process. And it was done completely with robotic sewing. Really, really interesting. And I think about what you just said, Nate, because I recently read that Vietnam announced that they wanted to incubate 100,000 tech companies by 2030. And I think that's a very, very laudable goal, to be able to incubate that much digital technology, whether it's in fintech or healthcare or manufacture. These are really, really important places for all of us to start to think about developing as we move into a fully digitized and digitalized world.
So Nate, I want to build on the conversation that you and Barry have been having, and certainly we have all been in Vietnam for many years and have worked very closely with our NGOs and our stakeholder organizations, worked with the supply chain partners in a very comprehensive manner, bringing innovation to bear, bringing compliance together to match the innovation and the evolution of processes and operations. And as we continue to pursue excellence, and Vietnam has driven so much of that, we also need to talk a little bit about how the digital evolution is going to affect corporate social responsibility, a topic that you work very intently on. So could you tell us from your perspective how you see digital impacting or affecting CSR practices?
Great question, Susan. Yeah, so I would put it into sort of three major categories. And one I alluded to earlier is the need to have supply chain visibility, because our consumers expect it and expect us to be able to have some sort of control and influence over what is happening way up our supply chain in the cotton field or at the cattle ranch. They're looking for us to be able to know that that's part of our supply chain and be able to influence what's happening there. So technology through blockchain, through other mechanisms, hopefully will give us the ability to trace and track, and then actually have and the ability to do something about that. The second component is how we do social compliance. How do we make sure that factories are doing what they should be doing to protect workers and keep workers safe? Can we use technology to basically be doing virtual tours of factories? Do we need to be there in person? Do we need all these third-party auditors that we deal with every day? And that part is actually being put to the test now as we are in all these travel lockdowns during COVID. We need to use the technology that's available to do our work and make sure that the factories are doing what they need to be doing, because there's no other way to do it right now. We can't send personnel into Vietnam or other countries. Nobody wants people from the United States right now. So, so that's something that we're exploring as well. How much can be done with technology? How effective is it? And that'll be sort of determined over the next 6 months as things start to open back up. We can go in and verify the results of these virtual visits and virtual CSR audits. And then the last thing is the people involved. Footwear has always been a labor-intensive industry. And that's had positives and negatives. It's been great for Vietnam because it's allowed the country to employ a lot of people and help them improve their economic livelihoods. So there's a lot of positives with technology, but there also could be the downsides. And Barry mentioned automation. If you're able to automate processes, or you're able to use 3D technology to create materials and actually final product, then you might not need as many people. And so what happens to those people? Now, in the case of Vietnam, there's many other industries that are growing that can pick up those people, and so it might not be an issue. But that is another area of the CSR, is what happens to the people as technology comes in and replaces the need for some of those people in our supply chain.
Real concern.
That's great. Thank you. We're going to start to begin to complete our conversation today. A few more questions and a few areas would love to talk with you about. And let's maybe pivot to some of your suggestions and how you would offer to our supply chain partners in Vietnam considerations that they should utilize in building their businesses and continuing to expand on the culture, on the global stage rather. And by that, I mean, we need to also talk about how digital CSR and compliance all work together. So if you were talking to a supplier in Vietnam, what would you share with them are some of the top things they should be on the lookout for as it relates to this digital revolution, and maybe bring in some pieces on the compliance and CSR side as well? Barry, would you like to start?
Sure. So I guess one of the things I would kind of like to reflect on just for a moment is the uniquely Vietnamese opportunity around technology and the digital. So I look at the youthful demographic of Vietnam and how there's been a very, very powerful lean into acceptance of digital solutions. I was really surprised to learn that mobile phone penetration in Vietnam is 150%. So most people have at least 2 phones. Their internet penetration is over 70%. That's very, very high on a global scale. What that's been really interesting for, just taking in a COVID perspective, is Vietnam was able to do contact tracking and tracing in a more robust way than almost any other country on earth, and with a record low number of cases. So that's an example of having the digital infrastructure and acceptance for what's happening in the digital at a much higher acceptance level than most other countries. And that's really, really interesting. So I look at how there are uniquely Vietnamese solutions to last mile supply chain. Now, for those of us that have been to Vietnam, we know that Grab is a really, really big deal there. And you can get everything delivered on a moped, on a bike, right? They've localized the idea and really solved for last mile logistics in a way that developing countries are still struggling with, right? So if you look at the increasing streaming services, the Vietnamization of last mile solutions, the high acceptance of what's happening in the digital, right? And then uniquely Vietnamese solutions like Momo and Tiki, which are really interesting in terms of, what does Venmo look like in the Vietnamese environment? Again, I just speak to the high acceptance level of technology as a major, major net positive. So already there's a leg up to being able to understand how technology can enhance society at a large level, and then how it can help businesses at an individual level. My main gist of all this is that when we're thinking about transformation, digital transformation, and all the things that go along with it, what's going to be a very, very interesting conversation to have is when manufacturers start to think like retailers. The question is not how manufacturers become better service providers. That's just an improvement. We think of innovation on a continuum, right? Improvement, evolution, revolution. If we're accelerating everything, then, and we're talking about this idea that I introduced a couple of seconds ago about one-to-one everything, it's not about what we can suggest from an incremental perspective. It's how do factories think in a consumer-centric way? That's hard to get your head around. And yet that will be expected. If we think of, if the desired end state is we're able to deliver in a fast, efficient way, things that brands request and consumers expect, that means that factories are going to have to think like retailers now.
That's a really interesting thought right there at the end, Barry, because that does bring up something. The one thing that has happened in the last few years in US trade policy that actually facilitates technology is increase in something called the de minimis, which allows you to bring in product to the United States duty-free if it's below $800 with very little paperwork, as long as it goes directly to the end consumer. And as you're talking about, Barry, if people are looking at, if factories are all of a sudden becoming retailers or thinking like retailers, why don't they actually become retailers? Could they sell direct from a factory in Vietnam directly to the end consumer in the United States and use provisions like de minimis so they're not paying tariffs on the product coming in? That could be a huge game changer that technology will have enabled them to do.
I love the idea of policy as future proofing. It's what it should do, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Although as long as this administration doesn't try and step that back a little bit, but
that's why we have you now.
Yeah. So
have the vision.
Yeah. But in terms of other compliance issues, I'm not to be the naysayer, but the other things to think about is, of course, a lot of the things you brought up, Barry, of how Vietnam has been so forward-looking, also brings up the issues that we have in the West and the United States and Europe is the idea of privacy again, and the challenges that could bring, where Vietnam is sort of one step removed from it, but things that Vietnam's doing could impact privacy concerns in terms of compliance issue, which is a big issue in the United States and even bigger in Europe, where they already have regulations in place that have been very difficult to comply with.
But that's a technical question. I'll jump in real quick because this is a conversation only for 1 second, is that I love the challenge being thrown back. We're looking at data and saying, can you look at my IP address and say, I am me? That throws it back to technology to say, what kind of anonymized technology can you provide? So let's take crowds, right? You can look at crowds and you can put CCTVs everywhere like they did in the UK. What if you use something like radar? Radar is anonymous. It just shows a body of a thing. How can we start to push back on technology and say, solve privacy for us, please? And what an interesting problem that is. Anyways, it's nothing of this is one and done, right? It's iterative, and as society pushes back and says, no, I don't want that, then someone has to go back to the lab, put their white coat on and figure it out, and as they should, right? It's a great dialogue. I find it inspiring. So anyways, you were about to say.
No, that's a really good point, Barry. I didn't really think about it that way, but technology creates new solutions, which might create new problems, which then gives the opportunity to create new solutions to those problems. And so, as you said, it's a continuum and hopefully a virtuous circle that keeps getting better and better.
Sounds like a Star Trek episode.
As we move forward. Yes.
Well, Nate, Barry, I think that is the perfect place to bring our conversation to conclusion today. In fact, I think we've mapped out an entire curriculum going forward for innovation and intelligence and digital transformation for our industry. So I want to thank you both. It was an incredible exchange. And also just to share with everyone that will be joining and listening in that we look forward to engaging with you and supporting your operations as we look to the future And let me encourage everyone to start by going to AAFA's website, aafaglobal.org, and we are all here to work together in our community. And with that, thank you again, and it was a wonderful conversation. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank
Susan.
you.